The night was unusually quiet for a bustling city. A cold wind swept through the streets, rattling newspaper sheets that clung stubbornly to the edges of sidewalks. Beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a frail-looking man hunched over, his clothes tattered, his shoes worn to the sole, his face hidden under a cap that seemed far too old to hold together. To every passerby, he was nothing more than a beggar, just another forgotten soul on the edge of survival. But hidden behind that disguise was a man who had everything. A man who, by the stroke of a pen, could change lives, build empires or break them. He was a millionaire, whose name commanded respect in boardrooms and headlines. Tonight, though, he wasn't here as a powerful tycoon, he was here as a test. His heart pounded with an unease money could never soothe. He wasn't testing strangers. No, his eyes were fixed on someone far closer, someone who carried his blood. Tonight, under the guise of poverty, he was about to face the truth about his only son. He clutched a worn paper cup in his trembling hands. The city's neon signs reflected in the pools of rainwater at his feet. He told himself he could endure whatever came, but deep down a whisper gnawed at his chest. What if my son doesn't see me at all? As footsteps echoed closer, he lifted his head ever so slightly. A figure approached, tall, confident, well-dressed, carrying the air of youth that had never known hunger. His son. The young man's face was lit by the screen of his phone, oblivious to the world around him. The disguised father's chest tightened. Every second felt like eternity. Would his son stop? Would he offer even a glance, a coin, a word? Or would he walk by as if the man before him didn't exist? The millionaire's breath caught. The answer was coming. And whatever it was, it would pierce deeper than any loss of fortune. If you were walking down that street and saw someone who looked like a beggar, would you stop? Or would you walk past just like everyone else? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious to hear your heart. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Billionaire Heart Stories for more emotional life lessons. By daylight, Richard Harlow's life looked flawless. He lived in a sprawling estate on the edge of the city, where fountains lined the driveway, and every window glittered with imported glass. People who read about him in magazines admired his success, envied his fortune, and often whispered his name as though it carried a touch of magic. To them, he was a man who had conquered life. But inside those polished walls, Richard carried a quiet storm. Years of building companies and expanding his empire had taken him away from the little boy he once carried on his shoulders. He had provided everything: schools with the highest reputation, cars, vacations, limitless credit cards, everything except the one thing money couldn't package: the discipline of humility. His son Daniel grew up in a world where doors always opened before he touched them, and where his last name bought loyalty he never earned. Friends surrounded him, but most were drawn to his wealth, not his heart. And slowly, without Richard noticing at first, his boy began to change. The once wide-eyed child who used to run barefoot in the garden now carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed kindness was optional. Richard's concern started small. He noticed Daniel's impatient tone with waiters at expensive restaurants. He saw how casually he dismissed the gardener who greeted him every morning. And then there were whispers, accounts from Richard's employees that Daniel was becoming cold, proud, and quick to insult those who weren't on his level. It ate at Richard. He had fought so hard to climb from nothing, once a hungry boy in a crowded apartment, wearing shoes with holes and dreaming of bread. He knew the pain of being overlooked, the sting of rejection, the hollow stomach of poverty. To him, every dollar had sweat behind it, but to Daniel, money was simply there, like air, always present, never questioned. One evening, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the family portrait above the fireplace. His eyes lingered on Daniel's confident smile, that same smile that once lit up his childhood innocence. "What if I've failed him?" Richard whispered into the empty room. That night, a decision took root in his heart. If Daniel was to inherit his empire one day, he needed to understand life beyond silk ties and marble floors. He needed to face what it meant to be powerless, what it felt like to meet someone in need. Richard decided on a plan, a dangerous one perhaps, but the only one he believed could open his son's eyes. He would strip away his own power, his status, his polished image. He would become invisible, the kind of man Daniel would normally pass without a second thought. And in that disguise, he would discover the truth. The following week, as Daniel continued his routines of gym visits, high-end dinners, and late nights with friends, Richard quietly prepared. He set aside his tailored suits and fine watches, replacing them with torn jackets, dirt-stained trousers, and a cap that smelled of dust and sweat. He dirtied his hands, smudged his face, and studied the posture of men he had seen slouched on street corners. When he looked in the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. For the first time in decades, Richard felt the weight of vulnerability pressing against his chest. And yet, behind that disguise was not just a test for Daniel, it was a test of his own courage as a father. When he stepped outside that night dressed as a beggar, no chauffeur waited at the gates, no sleek car hummed in the driveway. It was just him, walking down the same streets he once struggled on as a boy. And somewhere ahead, his son was living in a world he had never truly earned. The stage was set. The test was about to begin. Do you think wealth can ever blind someone from seeing real people and their struggles? Share your thoughts. I'd love to know what you think. It was late afternoon when Richard found his place near the entrance of a popular cafe, one his son visited almost daily. The air carried the smell of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked bread, while laughter spilled from groups of friends chatting on the patio. Richard sat low on the cold pavement, his back resting against the brick wall, a small paper cup trembling between his hands. The disguise was complete. His jacket hung loosely, smeared with dust, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a worn cap. He lowered his eyes, avoiding direct stares, just as he had seen real beggars do countless times. Around him people hurried past, some glancing quickly and then away, others not noticing at all. Every minute felt heavier, each second stretching into doubt. Then a familiar figure appeared. Daniel. Daniel strolled toward the cafe, phone pressed to his ear, his laughter loud enough to carry across the sidewalk. He wore a pressed shirt, designer shoes, and the kind of careless confidence that came from never knowing what it meant to struggle. Richard's heart skipped. This was it, the first moment. As Daniel drew closer, Richard lifted the cup slightly, his voice roughened by practice. "Spare some change, sir. Just a little, please." The words left his mouth like fragile glass. For a moment, he hoped for a pause, a glance, maybe even a shred of kindness. Daniel slowed, his eyes flicking down. For the briefest second, recognition almost stirred, but then it vanished. What he saw was only a beggar blocking his path. His lip curled with disdain. "Get a job, old man," Daniel muttered, stepping wide to avoid brushing against him. The phone never left his ear. His laughter returned, louder than before, as though the beggar hadn't existed at all. Richard's throat tightened. The cup shook in his hands. The sound of his son's dismissive tone echoed in his chest, sharper than any insult. He pressed himself against the wall, watching the boy disappear into the cafe, surrounded by friends who welcomed him with cheers. He had expected disappointment. He had prepared himself for indifference, but cruelty, that pierced like a blade. Still, Richard told himself this was only the beginning. Perhaps it was one careless moment, a bad day, a lapse in judgment. Maybe tomorrow would be different. He couldn't judge his son on one encounter, not yet. But as the evening shadows lengthened, and Richard stayed in his spot, waiting for Daniel to leave, his doubts deepened. He saw his son exit hours later, arms draped around his friend's shoulders, joking, carefree. The world adored him, but Richard saw what others could not, the emptiness behind the charm. That night, when Richard returned home to his quiet mansion, he didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his chest heavy with questions. Was his son truly blind to suffering? Had wealth hardened him beyond repair? Or was there still a chance, buried somewhere, to awaken his compassion? Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would try again. But deep down, a seed of dread had already begun to grow. If you were in the father's shoes, hearing your own child speak to you like that, how would it make you feel? Drop your honest answer in the comments. The next morning, Richard returned to the streets. He hadn't touched breakfast. The taste of Daniel's words still lingered bitter on his tongue. With every step he reminded himself, one moment does not define a man. He wanted to believe that his son had only been careless. A second chance might reveal kindness, even redemption. He chose a different spot this time, a busy square outside an office tower, where Daniel occasionally met colleagues for lunch. The wind carried the chatter of businessmen, the clatter of heels on pavement, the smell of grilled food from vendors lined along the street. Richard sat hunched over near a fountain, the cup in his hand, eyes lowered once again. Hours passed. Coins clinked into his cup now and then, small gestures from strangers he would never see again. Each sound gave him a pang. How was it possible that strangers could show more compassion than his own son? Just past noon, Daniel appeared, dressed sharply in a navy suit. He walked with a group of friends, his laughter rolling ahead of him. Richard's heart quickened as he raised his head slightly. This time he whispered, voice fragile yet clear, "Please, sir, just a little food." Daniel slowed. For a second Richard saw his son hesitate. Hope flickered in his chest. Maybe this time, but then Daniel's eyes hardened. He glanced at his friends, smirk tugging at his lips. "You're everywhere, aren't you? Why don't people like you just disappear?" The laughter of his companions rang out, feeding Daniel's pride. He walked past without another glance. Richard's hands trembled. He forced himself not to react, not to break the disguise. Inside, though, his chest felt like stone sinking deeper into water. That was not mere indifference, that was humiliation, and it was deliberate. For the rest of the day, Richard stayed in his place. He watched the world rush by, the hurried feet, the distracted faces, the rare soul who paused with kindness. He thought of his own youth, of nights when he went to bed hungry, of mornings when he longed for just one warm gesture. He thought of how far he had climbed, how fiercely he had worked to escape poverty, and he thought of the boy he loved, the boy he had spoiled into a man who now looked at suffering as an inconvenience. The following days became a ritual. Richard shifted his disguise from street corners to the front of shops, from cafes to train stations, everywhere Daniel's path might cross. Each time he hoped for a change. Each time he received nothing but dismissal. Sometimes it was silence, sometimes a sneer, sometimes a cutting remark that left invisible bruises on his heart. Yet something inside Richard also stirred, a determination. He realized this wasn't just a test anymore. It was a mirror reflecting the cost of his choices as a father. Every harsh word from Daniel echoed a truth Richard feared to admit, that perhaps he had handed his son wealth without ever teaching him how to be human. Late one evening, Richard sat alone on the curb after another painful encounter. His disguise clung to him like a burden, but for once he didn't think about the dust on his clothes or the ache in his knees. He thought about Daniel, his laughter, his arrogance, his blindness, and he asked himself the question he had avoided for years: what kind of man have I raised? The answer weighed heavy, but he knew the test wasn't over yet, because soon he would push it further, and the truth, whether sweet or bitter, would be undeniable. Do you think the father's test is fair? Or should he have confronted his son directly, instead of disguising himself? I'd love to hear what you would do in his place. The sun dipped behind the skyline, painting the streets in streaks of orange and gold. Richard had chosen a corner near the entrance of an upscale restaurant that evening. It wasn't just any restaurant, it was Daniel's favorite, a place he often visited with his closest circle of friends. Richard's hands tightened around the rim of his cup as he waited, his disguise heavier than ever. Soon enough, laughter and chatter filled the sidewalk. Daniel arrived, surrounded by friends, their voices carrying that careless joy only privilege seemed to bring. Richard forced his shoulders to slump lower, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Please, a little kindness." One of Daniel's friends nudged him, pointing, "There's that beggar again. He follows you everywhere, man." Daniel smirked, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Pathetic, isn't he? Can't people like that just stop being a burden on the rest of us?" The group laughed. Richard felt the words slash through him like knives. Still, he held his cup out, praying for even the smallest spark of compassion. But then Daniel stepped closer. He pulled a bill from his wallet and held it high, as though offering it, before dropping it deliberately into a puddle at Richard's feet. The laughter of his friends erupted once more as Daniel walked past, leaving the bill soaking in dirty water. Richard's heart nearly gave way. It wasn't just neglect anymore. It was mockery, humiliation, a cruelty he never thought his own flesh and blood could commit. He bent down, not for the money, but to hide the tears stinging his eyes. That night, back in his study, Richard sat in silence. The fireplace burned low, shadows flickering across the walls. His hands shook as he poured himself a glass of water, staring blankly at the reflection in the glass. He had seen arrogance before, he had heard insults, but watching his son humiliate a stranger, believing it was a stranger, was too much. It was that he enjoyed his power over someone weaker. That realization crushed Richard's chest. This wasn't the boy he once lifted onto his shoulders, the child who laughed at bedtime stories. This was a young man who had grown into pride without compassion. Richard pressed his palms against his face, whispering to himself, "Where did I go wrong?" For the first time he considered an unthinkable thought. Perhaps the empire he had built, the fortune he had secured, should never pass into his son's hands. Perhaps love wasn't enough if character was absent. The next morning, when Daniel breezed into the mansion with his usual arrogance, demanding money for another weekend trip, Richard looked at him differently. Behind his calm gaze, a storm was gathering. The test had gone far enough to reveal the truth, but Richard wasn't ready to reveal himself, not yet. Because before he showed Daniel who he truly was, he would make sure his son faced the consequences of his own choices. The disguise wasn't over, the test was only half done, and the next step would cut even deeper. If you were the father, seeing your own child mock and humiliate a beggar, would you forgive easily, or would you teach a hard lesson? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. If this story is touching your heart so far, show some love, hit the like button, share it around, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. The storm broke 3 nights later. Heavy rain poured down, soaking the city streets until the gutters overflowed. Richard stood beneath the awning of a shuttered shop, his thin disguise clinging to his skin, the chill cutting through him. His cup was nearly empty, only a few coins clinked at the bottom. Each sound of passing cars splashing through puddles only deepened the loneliness pressing against his chest. He had already seen enough, more than enough, to know the truth. But fate had other ideas. Through the curtain of rain, Richard spotted a familiar figure running across the street, jacket held over his head to block the water. Daniel. His son ducked under the same awning where Richard stood, shaking the rain from his hair, laughing as he spoke into his phone. For a moment Richard froze. He hadn't prepared for this. He turned his face away, lowering his cap. His heart hammered as he lifted his cup, voice raw and hoarse. "Please, just some help." Daniel glanced at him, eyes narrowing. "It's you again." His tone dripped with irritation. "Are you following me? I swear you people just don't know when to quit." Richard's throat burned, but he said nothing. He only extended the cup, rainwater dripping from its rim. Daniel snorted and shoved past him into the street again, rain soaking his suit. Over his shoulder, he threw words that landed heavier than stones. "Pathetic. No wonder you're out here. You don't deserve anyone's help." The sound of those words struck harder than thunder. Richard leaned back against the wall, his legs weak. For a moment the disguise didn't matter. He felt like that boy again, the boy who once begged for scraps, who once carried hunger in his belly and shame in his eyes. Only this time, it wasn't strangers who cut him down, it was his own son. When the rain finally eased, Richard walked home, every step heavier than the last. By the time he entered his mansion, peeling off the soaked disguise, his heart felt hollow. He poured himself into the armchair in his study, staring at the portrait above the fireplace. The smiling boy in that photo was gone, replaced by a man who mocked weakness. Tears came then, hot and unrestrained. Richard pressed a hand to his chest, whispering into the silence, "He has no kindness, none at all, and it's my fault. I gave him everything but the one thing that mattered." It was a breaking point. The test was no longer just an experiment. It was a revelation he could no longer deny. His empire, his fortune, his legacy, he could not hand it over to a man who laughed at suffering. That night, the father made a decision. The son he loved would no longer live under the shelter of wealth without consequence. If Daniel could not see the value of compassion, he would have to learn it through the fire of struggle, and Richard knew exactly how it would begin. If your child spoke those words to you, cold, cruel, cutting, would you still protect them, or would you let them face the world alone? Share your thoughts below. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the mansion, soft and golden, but it did little to warm Richard's heart. He sat at the long dining table, untouched breakfast in front of him, staring at the silver cutlery and gleaming plates. Across the hall, Daniel strolled in, yawning, his phone in hand. "Dad," he said casually, not even looking up, "I need money for the weekend. We're going away again. Just transfer it." Richard's eyes lingered on him. Sharp suit, polished shoes, arrogance in every movement. For years he had looked past these details, telling himself Daniel would grow out of them. But now, every flaw blazed like a warning light. In that moment, clarity struck Richard like lightning. This wasn't just about one son's cruelty. It was about everything Richard had allowed to slip through his fingers. Years of sheltering, years of indulgence, years of mistaking wealth for love. He had created the very arrogance that now cut him to pieces. But clarity didn't come with despair alone. It came with resolve. Richard rose slowly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made Daniel glance up. "You'll get no more transfers, Daniel." Daniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" "You heard me," Richard said, stepping closer. "You've lived on my wealth long enough. You've worn my name like a crown while treating people as if they were beneath you. That ends today. Confusion flickered across Daniel's face. "You can't be serious." "I'm more serious than I've ever been," Richard replied, eyes steady. "From now on you'll work, you'll earn, you'll stand where others stand, without my name to shield you. If you want to know the value of $1, you'll sweat for it. If you want respect, you'll learn to give it." Daniel's voice rose, indignant. "You can't just cut me off. I'm your son." Richard's chest tightened, but his resolve did not waver. "Exactly, and that's why I have to do this. Because I would rather see you start from nothing than watch you grow into a man with everything and no heart." Daniel laughed bitterly, but the sound faltered against the steel in his father's eyes. For the first time he realized this wasn't an idle threat. When Daniel stormed out, slamming the door behind him, Richard stood in silence, his heart pounding. The mansion felt emptier than ever, but within him was a strange new calm. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Daniel would resist, he would rage, he would despise him. But pain was sometimes the only teacher that could pierce pride. And Richard had resolved that he would rather be hated now, if it meant Daniel could learn to be a man worth respecting later. That was the breakthrough. He could no longer be the father who merely gave. He had to be the father who shaped, and for the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe through struggle, his son could still find the humanity he had lost. Do you believe tough love can truly change a person? Or does it only push them further away? I'd love to hear what you think. Comment below. The evening air was heavy, a restless quiet hanging over the city. Richard stood once more in his disguise, the ragged coat pulled over his shoulders, capped low across his brow. This time, though, he wasn't waiting for a chance. He had chosen the spot deliberately, the very steps of Daniel's favorite club. He knew his son would arrive, laughing and careless, surrounded by friends, and when he did, the truth would no longer hide in the shadows. It wasn't long before headlights swept across the street and a sleek car pulled up. Daniel stepped out, phone in one hand, the other adjusting his tailored jacket. Friends greeted him with cheers, their laughter rising above the hum of traffic. Richard shifted forward, cup trembling in his hand. He forced his voice to break, to sound weary. "Sir, please, just a little help." Daniel stopped. His friends gathered around, smirking, waiting for his response. He tilted his head, recognition flickering. "It's you again, always begging, always pathetic." The words stung, but Richard stood firm. Slowly he lifted his head, pulling the cap away. His face lined and weary, it emerged from beneath the disguise. His eyes met Daniel's directly for the first time. Silence fell. The smirk on Daniel's lips froze. His eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "Dad," gasps rippled through his circle of friends. Richard dropped the cup, the coins scattering across the pavement like tiny echoes of judgment. He straightened his shoulders, the weight of the disguise sliding off him like a burden finally set down. "Yes," Richard said, his voice steady. "It's me, and I have seen enough. You humiliated me when I was weak. You had no mercy, no compassion, not even for a stranger." He stepped closer, his eyes burning into his son's. "And now I know the truth about you, not as a father blinded by love, but as a man who has witnessed your heart." The street was silent except for the faint hum of traffic. Daniel's friends shuffled uneasily, glancing at one another, but none dared to speak. "Dad, Daniel stammered, his voice breaking. "Don't," Richard cut him off. "Don't excuse yourself. Don't tell me you didn't mean it. You did. Every word, every sneer, every cruel laugh, you meant it. And I can no longer pretend I don't see who you are." The strength in Richard's voice trembled with pain. "You are my son by blood, Daniel, but you are no heir to my name until you prove you have a heart worthy of it." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes, his pride cracking under the weight of shame. He reached for his father, but Richard stepped back, his face hard though his heart ached. "You will live without my wealth. You will stand where others stand, and you will learn what it means to hunger, to labor, to see the world without a shield of privilege. Only then will you understand the value of what you've thrown away tonight." The final words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Richard turned from him, the clatter of his footsteps echoing as he walked away. Behind him, Daniel stood frozen, surrounded by the friends who suddenly seemed so small, so shallow, in the shadow of what had just been revealed. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt truly poor. If you were the son standing there in shame, what would be the first thing you'd say to your father? Share it in the comments. I want to hear your heart. The night after the confrontation, Daniel didn't return home. His room, once a symbol of comfort and indulgence, sat dark and untouched. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the echo of his father's words. Days turned into weeks. Richard kept to his decision. The credit cards were cancelled. The transfers stopped. The friends who once laughed at Daniel's side began to drift away when the free dinners and trips vanished. With no fortune to shield him, Daniel faced a world he had never known. Applications ignored, doors shut, eyes glancing past him as though he were invisible. At first he was angry. He cursed his father in private, telling himself it was cruel, unjust. But anger gave way to exhaustion. Work came eventually, menial, grinding jobs where he learned the ache of standing for hours, the humiliation of orders barked by strangers, the small joy of earning a wage that barely lasted through the week. It was there in the grit and sweat of labor that something began to shift. One evening, on his way home, Daniel saw an old man sitting by the roadside, shivering, a paper cup trembling in his hand. He slowed. His heart, once hardened, hesitated. For the first time he saw, not just a beggar, but a human being. He reached into his pocket, pulled out what little he had, and placed it gently into the man's cup. The stranger's whispered thanks pierced him deeper than any luxury ever had. Meanwhile, Richard watched quietly from afar. He never let Daniel see him, but he checked, often. He saw the friends fade away, saw his son walking tired and alone, saw the slow cracking of pride that once stood like armor, and though it pained him, he also saw something he hadn't in years change. Months later, father and son met again, not in disguise this time, but face to face in the mansion's study. Daniel looked thinner, older somehow, yet there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He stood before his father in silence, head bowed. "I was wrong," Daniel whispered. "I mocked what I never understood. I laughed at pain I never felt. You were right to take everything, because it was the only way I could see what matters." Richard's throat tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Wealth can build walls, Daniel, but it can also build bridges. From now on you'll decide which one you create. That choice will define you more than my fortune ever could." Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he nodded, the weight of his father's forgiveness pressing heavier than punishment ever had. That night, Richard sat by the fireplace, staring once more at the family portrait. This time his heart felt lighter. He had not lost his son. He had found him again, broken, humbled, but finally ready to grow. And for the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to hope that his legacy would not be his wealth, but the man his son would one day become. Do you think the father did the right thing by forcing his son to face hardship? Or should love mean protecting, no matter what? Leave your answer below. I'd love to know your perspective. As Richard and Daniel's story reminds us, true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the compassion we show others. Stories like these carry lessons that touch the heart, and sometimes they mirror our own lives more than we realize. If this story spoke to you, I'd love for you to stay connected with us. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Billionaire Heart Stories so you won't miss the next journey we tell together. Your support means more than you know. It keeps these stories alive, and it makes this community a place where hearts meet and grow.